I bet you didn't know about Carl Tanzler, the man who refused to let his love die. He worked at the Marine Hospital Service in Key West, Florida. That's where he met a young Cuban-American patient named Elena de Hoyos. Elena was brought to the hospital by her mother for examination because she had fallen ill. As soon as Carl laid eyes on her, he was in love. He described her as the most beautiful dark-haired woman he had ever seen. He even went as far as to claim that he had visions about her. Despite the fact that Elena was already married, Carl didn't let that stop him. He even went as far as taking Elena from the hospital back to her family's home so that he could treat her there personally. Elena's diagnosis ended up being tuberculosis, and at the time, there was no treatment for it. It was almost always fatal. At Elena's family's home, Carl took different types of radiation treatments, medicine, anything that he could possibly think of to try and cure her. As Carl was treating Elena, he also showered her with gifts, fine jewelry, lavish clothing, anything that he could possibly think that could woo her. There's also claims that Carl outright confessed his love to Elena, and she denied him. She did not reciprocate his feelings. Despite Carl's best efforts, Elena eventually died of tuberculosis. Carl was absolutely devastated. He was so devastated that he actually convinced Elena's family to let him pay for her burial. He commissioned for an above-ground mausoleum to be built as her tomb. Here's the thing though, Carl also had his own key to the tomb. So it started out for a while where every single night Carl would go into the mausoleum and be with Elena. But over time this proved to not be enough. Finally, around 2 years after her original death, Carl decided to take her body home with him. How he did it was he went into the mausoleum and he loaded Elena's body up into a small toy wagon and drug her back to his house. Carl's reasoning for this is he said at night when he would be serenading Elena with Spanish songs, her spirit would tell him, "Please take me home with you. Please take me home with you. I don't need to be here." When Carl brought her home, he was determined to keep her from decaying. He fastened her bones together with piano wire and inserted glass eyes. As Elena's skin started to decompose, Carl then took wet cloths, covered them in wax, and then covered them with plaster of Paris to try and keep her skin from falling off. As Elena's hair started to fall out, Tanzler would keep it, and eventually all the hair from her decomposing scalp he used to fashion a wig. Carl also stuffed Elena's body cavities with rags to try to give her a full look. He kept her dressed in fine clothing, gloves, elaborate jewelry, and most of the time he left her propped up in his bed. Tanzler also went to the lengths of using disinfectants, deodorizers, anything that he could possibly use to coat the smell. The worst part for me, though, is the fact that Carl fashioned a papier-mâché vagina for Elena. He claims that he never performed necrophilia on her corpse, but I'm saying if you went as far as to make a papier-mâché vagina, you probably did. 7 years later, after Carl had taken Elena's corpse, her sister had heard a rumor that he had possibly grave robbed. Supposedly, her sister went over one night and saw Tanzler dancing with her sister's corpse through his living room window. Her sister immediately ran to authorities where they arrested and detained Carl Tanzler. Carl was given a mental evaluation and he passed. They said he was mentally sane. They tried to charge him with grave robbing and desecration of a body. But during the hearing, the judge ruled that his crime was out of the statute of limitations. They could no longer charge him because 7 years had passed. But that's crazy to me because they found Elena's body in his possession. They knew that he absolutely had her. When they finally retrieved Elena's corpse is when they discovered the plaster on her skin, the glass eyes that had been inserted, the papier-mâché vagina. They were mortified that someone could do this to another person. Because of the absolute insanity of this crime, they actually had Elena's body on display for a while. It was at the Dean Lopez Funeral Home where it was viewed by over 6,800 people. The craziest part to me that blows my mind is that after the court hearing, Carl Tanzler had the audacity to ask Elena's family if he could have her body back. Obviously, the family said no, and they were so bothered by it that they actually had Elena's body buried in an unmarked grave so that this could never happen again. When this case went public, people seemed to be more sympathetic towards Carl than anything else. They thought it was romantic. People pitied this man who was so obsessed with a woman that didn't love him back that he kept her corpse for 7 years. I'm sorry, there's nothing sweet or romantic about that. To make things even weirder, Tanzler ended up remarrying, but he kept a death mask of Elena. Some claimed he had an actual full body model of her that he kept, but there's no proof of that. That's purely speculations. Now, when it comes to Carl Tanzler's death, there's several different stories. Some people say he was found on the floor after being dead for 3 weeks behind one of his organs. Though there's another tidbit of information that it cannot be proved or disproven. The other claim is that he died while cradling Elena's death mask.